10 men can make a lot of noise, especially when they're drunk, angry, and believe the whole world owes them a debt. Their boots, caked in the dust of a long drive from Texas, stomped thunderously on the flimsy floorboards of Meilin's laundry. The air, thick with steam and the smell of lye soap, was now choked with cheap whiskey and malice. Laughter, coarse and sharp as jagged glass, ricocheted off the walls, hung with the snow-white shirts of Redemption Gulch's wealthy citizens. "Look at her," roared one of them, a hulking brute with a red beard dotted with crumbs from yesterday's bread blink in her eyes like a frightened quail. They surrounded her, small and fragile as a porcelain doll in her modest blue dress. Meilin pressed herself into a corner, clutching a stack of freshly ironed linen to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird against the bars of a cage. She didn't understand half their words, but the intonations, the predatory stares, the lewd gestures, that language was universal, and it promised nothing good. Their leader, Isaac Burton, stepped closer. He was taller than the rest, with a face that might have been handsome were it not for the perpetual stamp of arrogance and cruelty. He reached out and grabbed her by her thin braid, black and shimmering as a raven's wing. He yanked it, hard, so hard that she cried out, a thin, piercing shriek, like a mouse caught in a trap. The sound, full of despair and pain, was drowned in the guffaws of 10 throats. Isaac reveled in his power, his impunity. He felt like a god in this small, steam-scented world. "What, don't you like it, slant-eye?" he hissed into her ear, blasting her with a wave of stale liquor. "You should be grateful we're paying any attention to you at all, to someone like you." It was at that exact moment that a shadow fell across the laundry's threshold, a long, thin shadow that seemed to swallow all the meager light filtering in from the dusty street. The guffawing slowly died, replaced by a baffled silence. The cowboys, one by one, turned to look. Standing in the doorway was David Slater. He was neither tall nor broad-shouldered. Years of hard labor under the scorching Arizona sun had burned everything superfluous from his frame, leaving only a sinewy, dried-out body stretched over sun-darkened skin. His clothes were simple and faded, a gray flannel shirt, patched denim trousers, and worn-out boots without spurs. But none of that mattered. All that mattered were his eyes, pale blue, almost colorless. They regarded the scene with an icy, dead calm. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was only an emptiness, a scorched desert where all emotions had long since perished. He said nothing. He just stood and watched. His gaze swept over the flushed faces of the cowboys, the overturned laundry baskets, the frightened, tearful eyes of Meilin, and came to rest on Isaac Burton's hand, still clutching the black braid. The silence became oppressive. It was thicker than the steam from the boilers. From the street came the bark of a dog and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer sound from another. Peaceful world that had no place in this suffocating room. "And what's this scarecrow?" Isaac finally broke the silence, letting go of Meilin's hair. He twisted his lips into a contemptuous sneer, trying to reclaim his and his men's lost bravado. "You lost, old-timer. The church is in the other direction." David Slater took a step forward, and the sound of it in the silence was like the fall of a hammer. He paid Isaac no mind. His gaze was fixed on the girl cowering on the floor. In her trembling form, in her desperate attempt to become invisible, he saw a ghost from a past that had haunted him for 20 long years. He saw another woman, with the same dark hair, cornered in another house. He heard other drunken laughter, just as cruel and self-satisfied, and he felt the same white-hot rage rising from the depths of his soul, a rage that had once cost him everything, his family, his freedom, his life. He slowly raised a hand and pointed at Isaac. His voice, when he spoke, was low and raspy, as if his vocal cords were made of sandpaper. Let her go. It wasn't a demand, not a request. It was a statement of fact, of inevitability, like the rising of the sun or the coming of winter. Isaac Burton laughed, loudly, defiantly. His men, emboldened by his reaction, joined in. "You hear that? He's giving me orders." Isaac drew himself up to his full height, his hand toying with the grip of the revolver at his hip. "Listen, old man, I'm Isaac Burton. My father owns half this valley, and who are you? Just some drifter who stinks of dust and desperation. So, turn around and get out of here before my boys decide to clean their boots with you." David didn't move. His eyes never left Isaac's. Something in them had changed. The emptiness was beginning to fill. Slowly, reluctantly, like water seeping through cracks in parched earth. It was memory, the memory of the smell of gunpowder and blood, of his wife Sarah's scream, of how he had broken a man's life with his bare hands for daring to touch her, and of how the sheriff, that man's friend, had clapped him in irons while Sarah wept on the porch of their burned-down home. "I won't tell you twice," David said, a note of steel entering his voice. The insolence of this vagrant was starting to get under Isaac's skin. The sneer vanished. His face turned crimson. "It seems you don't understand who you're talking to," he hissed. "Boys, teach him some manners." Two cowboys, standing closest to David, moved forward. They were young, strong, and drunk on whiskey and their own impunity. One of them, with a foolish grin, reached out to grab David's shoulder. What happened next was almost too fast for the eye to follow. Quick as the strike of a rattlesnake, David didn't flinch. He let the hand approach, and in the last instant, as the cowboy's fingers were about to touch his shirt, he made an imperceptible movement. His body, which had seemed so stiff and slow, suddenly gained the fluidity of mercury. He stepped inside the man's reach, moving off the line of attack, and his left hand clamped onto the attacker's wrist like a steel trap. The cowboy didn't even have time to cry out before David twisted his arm at an unnatural angle. A dry, nauseating crack of breaking bone echoed in the room. The grin on the cowboy's face was replaced by a mask of unspeakable agony. His eyes bulged. Before he could fall, David's right hand, clenched into a fist as hard as stone, delivered a short, almost invisible blow to the base of his throat. The cowboy let out a choked gasp, like the sound of a burst bagpipe, and collapsed in a heap. On the plank floor, clutching his broken arm and gasping for air, the second man, who had been following close behind, froze for a split second in astonishment. That split second was all David needed. He didn't wait for an attack. He stepped forward to meet it, his worn boot slamming into the cowboy's knee with the force of a battering ram. Another crack, this one duller, followed by a wild, animalistic howl. The second goon crumpled next to the first, clutching his shattered kneecap and rocking back and forth from the unbearable pain. It all happened in less than 5 seconds. The silence that followed was deafening. It rang in the ears, heavy and viscous. The 8 remaining cowboys, including Isaac Burton, stood frozen like pillars of salt. Their drunken revelry had vanished without a trace, leaving only a clammy, cold sweat on their temples. They weren't looking at their fallen comrades. They were looking at David Slater, at this quiet, unremarkable drifter who had just, with ice-cold calm and terrifying efficiency, crippled to healthy men. He no longer seemed old and weak to them. Now they saw something else before them, something predatory, precise, and deadly dangerous. His calm was more frightening than any rage. There was no thrill of the fight in him, no victor's malice. There was only methodical, ruthless work. Like a butcher dressing a carcass, Meilin, huddled in her corner, watched with wide eyes. The fear for her life had been replaced by a different, fierer, primal terror in the face of the violence being done on her behalf. This man, whom she had never seen before, had become an avenging angel, and his wings were blacker than the darkest night. Moments like these reveal a person's true nature. When the masks of civilization fall away, all that remains is the primal choice, to fight or to flee, to protect or to prey. And looking at the resolve in David's eyes, at the cowardice in his opponents, you can't help but ask yourself, whose side are you on? If stories of indomitable spirit and the fight for justice, even when the whole world is against you, resonate with your soul, show it. A simple like on this video and a subscription to the channel will become your silent voice. In support of heroes like David, it helps us continue to find and tell the stories that truly matter. And now, let's return to Redemption Gulch, where the smell of steam has mingled with the smell of blood, and the end of this story is far from decided. Isaac Burton was the first to recover. His face, previously crimson with anger, had turned a pale, deathly white, but not from fear, from fury, from humiliation. Some filthy vagrant had dared to raise a hand to his men, to his property, as he saw it, in his town. You're a dead man, old-timer," he hissed, his hand moving slowly, almost theatrically, to the handle of his revolver. It was an expensive Colt Peacemaker with an ivory grip, a gift from his father, a symbol of his power and status. The steel of his revolver glinted coldly in the dim light of the laundry. The other cowboys, seeing this, seemed to receive a silent command. They fanned out across the room, taking positions, surrounding David and cutting off his escape. Their hands, too, fell to the grips of their weapons. The atmosphere in the room became electric. One wrong step, one sudden move, and the laundry would become a slaughterhouse. David Slater didn't even glance at the barrel pointed at him. He continued to look directly into Isaac's eyes, and in his icy gaze, Burton saw something he never expected. Not fear, not defiance. He saw ... pity, as if he were looking at a capricious, foolish child playing with fire, not understanding that he was about to burn himself to a cinder. "Do you really want to die for your pride?" David's voice was quiet, almost indifferent, but each word struck like the lash of a whip. "You're the one who's going to die, Drifter," Isaac shrieked, cocking the hammer. The deafening click cut through the air. "I'll count to 3, and if you're not gone to hell out of here, I'll put a hole in your filthy hide big enough to see the sun through." He raised the revolver, aiming squarely at David's chest. His hand trembled slightly. He had never killed anyone before, but now, under the gazes of his men, in the face of this unheard-of insult, he felt he had to see it through. Double quotes. David didn't move. His body was tensed like a coiled spring, but outwardly he remained perfectly calm. He had seen this 100 times before. In the prison yard, in the mines where a life was worth less than a mouthful of water. He knew this dance of death. He knew how drunken bravado turned to fear, and fear to recklessness. And he knew that Isaac Burton had already crossed that line, too. David's gaze flickered to the side. He noted the large copper boiler of scalding water on the stove against the wall. Thick steam rose from it, filling the air with moisture. Next to the boiler, on a wooden shelf, sat heavy Castian flatirons, still hot from use. He registered their position. He was calculating angles, trajectories, seconds. His mind, honed by years of survival in inhuman conditions, worked with the cold precision of a clockwork mechanism. "Get out," I said. Isaac's shout was almost hysterical now. He wanted David to leave. He didn't want to pull the trigger, but he could no longer back down. Meilin pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from screaming. Tears streamed down her cheeks, dripping onto the white shirts she still clutched to her chest. She prayed to all the gods she knew, but she understood that they were not in this room. There were only 10 angry men, and one quiet one who had decided to stand between her and death. Isaac Burton took a deep breath, preparing to shout the final, fateful word. His finger on the trigger, WHITENED. But Isaac Burton never said the word 3. In the very instant his lips were forming for the fatal sound, the world exploded into motion. David Slater did not retreat, did not try to dodge a bullet. He attacked. His movement was inhumanly fast, honed by 1,000 days when hesitation meant death. He didn't rush at Isaac. He lunged to the side, toward the wall where the boiler of laundry water seethed on the massive wood-burning stove. His boot slammed into a wooden crate that held a basket of dirty linen. The crate shot sideways with a crash, knocking 2 cowboys off their feet and forcing them to stumble back instinctively. It bought him a fraction of a second. The first shot finally rang out, loud, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet whistled through the air where David's chest had just been and slammed into the wall, leaving an ugly hole and showering plaster. But David was already at the stove. He didn't grab the heavy boiler. Nearby on a bench lay a large wooden ladle with a long handle. In one smooth, practiced motion, he dipped it into the cauldron of boiling, bubbling water, and pivoting, flung its contents in a wide arc toward the clustered cowboys. What followed was a sound from hell itself. Wild, inhuman screams of pain tore through the air. The men who a second ago had been mere drunken bullies were instantly transformed into writhing creatures of agony. The boiling water soaked through their thick denim and flannel shirts, sticking to their skin, continuing its searing work. 2 of them, who had taken the main blast, fell to the floor howling, rolling and trying to rip off their burning clothes. A third, who got a splash to the face, let out a piercing shriek and, clutching his eyes, ran blindly into a wall. The chaos was absolute. The laundry, which minutes before had been a stage for drunken bravado, had become a branch of the inferno. Thick steam mingled with gunpowder smoke. The acrid smell of sweat and whiskey mixed with the nauseating stench of pain. The remaining cowboys, who had only been lightly splashed, recoiled in terror. Their fighting spirit, Their collective courage, fueled by alcohol, had evaporated in a cloud of steam. Now it was every man for himself. Isaac Burton, standing slightly aside, was unharmed, but his face was a mask of shock and fury. His perfectly planned humiliation of a little laundress had turned into a bloody farce. He raised his revolver again, but in the turmoil and clouds of steam, his target had become a blur. This was exactly what David needed. While everyone's attention was fixed on the miserable men writhing on the floor, he took another step, bringing him to the shelf of Without hesitation, he grabbed one by its wooden handle. The cast iron still held the heat of the stove. It was a heavy, deadly weapon in his hand. One of the cowboys, a bull-necked bruiser, recovered from the initial shock and, drawing his revolver, turned toward David. He was too close to miss, but he was too slow. David didn't wait for him to take aim. He stepped forward, and the searing hot iron slammed into the hand that held the weapon. Another scream, but different this time, choked, full of surprise and agony. Skin sizzled, and the air filled with the smell of scorched flesh. The revolver fell to the floor with a dull thud, and its owner, staring at his hand burned to the bone, collapsed to his knees, passing out from the shock of the pain. "Kill him! Shoot him, you useless bastards!" Isaac shrieked, backing toward the door. He tried to aim, but David was constantly moving, using the cowboys still on their feet as a human shield. Another shot. The bullet ricocheted off the copper boiler with a deafening clang and flew into the ceiling. Panic was mounting. Two of the remaining 5, deciding they'd had enough, made a break for the exit, shoving their leader aside. They spilled out onto the street like corks from a champagne bottle, carrying the news that something unimaginable was happening in the Chinese woman's laundry. 3 remained. 3 against 1, but it no longer mattered. The psychological advantage was entirely on David's side. In their eyes, he was no longer a man, but some kind of demon, a spawn of the convict pits who could not be stopped. He gave them no time to recover. He stepped toward the nearest one, who was still hesitantly clutching his revolver. David didn't look at the weapon. He looked into the man's eyes, and the cowboy saw his own death in them. His hands trembled. He fired, but the bullet went into the floor, kicking up a cloud of wood dust. The next moment, David was on him. He didn't use the iron. His left hand shot out and grabbed the barrel of the revolver, twisting it aside. Simultaneously, his right elbow delivered a short, crushing blow to the cowboy's nose. Bone crunched, hot blood gushed, covering the man's face. He went limp, and David, shoving him aside like a rag doll, was left facing the last 2 opponents. Isaac Burton, and one other, who was backing away toward the far wall in terror, muttering curses. All this time, in the back of his mind, David wasn't seeing these terrified drunks. He was seeing other faces, arrogant, certain of their impunity. He wasn't hearing the screams of pain from Burns, but the scream of terror from his wife, Sarah. 20 years ago, he had been different, young, hot-headed, full of righteous anger. He had burst into his own home and seen 3 men surrounding her. He didn't think, he just hit. He hit until one of them stopped moving. He was protecting his family, but the lawmen who came later saw only one thing. A poor farmer had killed the son of an influential cattleman. Self-defense. They had only laughed in his face, and he had been sent to hell on earth, to the Yuma quarries, to reflect on the fact that anger was a luxury he could no longer afford. The years of hard labor had burned the anger out of him, but they hadn't burned out the memory. They had taught him something else: cold calculation, efficiency. They had turned his body into a weapon and his mind into a calculator, instantly assessing the odds of survival. What he was doing now was not revenge, it was surgery. He was removing a tumor. Before it killed the patient, the last cowboy, not counting Isaac, broke. He threw his revolver to the floor and raised his hands. "I'm done. I give. Don't touch me," he whimpered. David merely swept him with his icy gaze and turned away. He was no threat. The threat was by the door. Isaac Burton, pale, his hands shaking, was still aiming at him. The laundry was littered with the bodies of his men. The air was thick and heavy. The floor was slick with water and blood. His entire world, built on his father's money and the fear of others, had crumbled in a matter of minutes. "I'll kill you," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore, only fear and wounded pride. "You've already lost," David said quietly. He began to move toward him, slowly, step by step. He was still clutching the cast iron. You came here with your men to indulge your pride at the expense of a defenseless woman. You thought there was strength in numbers, in weapons, in your father's name, but you were wrong. Strength is when you have nothing left to lose. He was now 3 steps from Isaac. And I, he continued, a note of infinite, cosmic weariness in his voice, have had nothing to lose for 20 years. Isaac pulled the trigger. Click. A misfire. Or maybe the rounds in the cylinder had simply run out. In the chaos, he had been firing blindly. Isaac's eyes widened in terror as he realized it. That split second of confusion was all David needed. He lunged forward. The iron whistled through the air, but he didn't strike Isaac's head. The blow landed on the wrist that held the revolver. There was a sound like a dry branch snapping. Isaac howled in pain, his fingers unclenching. The Colt peacemaker with the ivory grip, the symbol of his power, splashed into a puddle on the floor. Before Isaac could react, David grabbed him by the shirt front and slammed him violently against the doorframe. He pinned him there, towering over him, his face inches from Burton's. Isaac gasped with fear and pain, staring into those empty, merciless blue eyes. "Listen to me very carefully, boy," David hissed, and his breath smelled of road dust and prison despair. "You will never come near this woman again. You will never set foot on this street again. You will forget her name and her face. And if I ever see you or any of your friends near her again, ... He didn't finish the sentence. He simply tightened his grip on Isaac's broken wrist. The man choked back a sob, and tears streamed down his cheeks. Not from pain, from humiliation. "Do you understand me?" Isaac nodded frantically, unable to speak a word. David released his grip, and Isaac's body slid to the floor in a heap. He looked down at him with contemptuous disgust, then turned and walked back into the wrecked laundry. Silence. Only the moans of the wounded, and the sound of water dripping from the ceiling. The cowboy who had surrendered was already gone. Isaac Burton, sobbing, crawled out the door. The battle was over. David Slater stood amidst the wreckage, breathing heavily. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind only a dull ache in his knuckles and a gnawing emptiness in his soul. He felt no triumph. He felt no satisfaction. He felt only an infinite weariness. He had done it again. He had crossed the line again, and he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. He slowly turned toward the corner where Meilin had been hiding all this time. She was sitting in the same spot, curled into a ball, clutching the stack of snow-white shirts, now stained with ugly brown Her eyes were huge, dark, like 2 bottomless pools reflecting all the horror of what had just happened. She was looking at him, not at the cowboys, at him, at her savior, at her monster. He took a step in her direction, and she flinched. There was not only fear in her gaze, there was something else, gratitude. Or he didn't know. He had long ago forgotten how to read anything in a face other than a threat. He stopped. He didn't know what to say. The words were stuck in his throat. What could he say to her? "Sorry about the mess. They won't bother you again." It all seemed empty and foolish, and in the ensuing silence, they heard a new sound. It came from the street. The sharp, measured, inexorable tread of heavy boots on the wooden sidewalk. Someone was coming, and not alone. The law, the sheriff, the inevitable consequence of any violence in a town like Redemption Gulch. David slowly straightened up. He knew what was coming. Again the questions, the accusations, the face of Isaac Burton, twisted with a thirst for revenge, and the word of an ex-convict against the word of the richest man's son in the county. He knew how this would end. He had been through it before, and he was ready. But when he looked at Meilin, at her trembling form, he realized one thing. This time was different. 20 years ago, he had defended his love. Today, he had defended a total stranger, and looking into her dark, frightened eyes, for the first time in many years, he felt something other than emptiness, something fragile and almost forgotten, a feeling that he had done the right thing. And that feeling, strangely enough, gave him strength, the strength to face whatever was waiting for him beyond the door. The door creaked open, admitting a sliver of dusty evening light, and 3 men. Leading them was Sheriff Meilin, middle-aged man with a tired, weathered face, and a badge that had grown dull from time and compromise. Behind him were 2 deputies, young men with frightened eyes, who clutched their Winchesters nervously, as if expecting the very walls of the laundry to start shooting at them. Sheriff Miller stopped on the threshold, his eyes slowly taking in the the scene of destruction. He had been the law in Redemption Gulch for 15 years and had seen a great deal. Drunken brawls, knife fights over card debts, even one duel over a lady of questionable honor. But he had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a brawl. It was a slaughter. 5 men were moaning and writhing on the floor in pools of water and blood. Several others lay unconscious. The air was heavy, stagnant, smelling of steam, gunpowder, burnt flesh, and fear. His gaze passed over the wounded, lingered on the overturned boiler and scattered irons, and came to rest on the 2 still figures. At the center of the chaos, the woman, huddled in the corner, small and broken, like a wildflower after a hurricane, and the man, David Slater, stood in the middle of the room, unmoving. He hadn't dropped his makeshift weapon, the iron. He simply held it in his lowered hand. His face was devoid of all expression. He didn't look like a victor. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who had just come home from work, a very hard and dirty job. Slater, the sheriff's voice was flat, emotionless. He recognized him, of course. He did. In a town this size, everyone knew everyone, especially those who bore the invisible brand of a convict. What in God's name happened here? Before David could answer, a hysterical shriek came from behind the sheriff. It was Isaac Burton. He was standing in the street, propped up by his uninjured cronies, pointing at David with a trembling hand. His wrist broken. He attacked us, Sheriff. Isaac screamed, his voice a mixture of pain, rage, and self-righteous certainty. We just came to pick up our laundry, and this lunatic jumped us. He tried to kill us, kill all of us. He's a murderer, a convict, degenerate. Arrest him. Sheriff Miller didn't even turn his head. He continued to look at David, and a complex tangle of thoughts was visible in his tired eyes. He knew Isaac Burton and his crowd all too well. He knew their drunken antics, their cruelty, their certainty that the money of his father, Jedediah Burton, would buy them any indulgence. And he saw the scene before him. 10 armed cowboys against 1 unarmed drifter, and a fragile Chinese woman. Isaac's story didn't add up. It reeked of lies as strongly as the room reeked of pain. Slater, I asked you a question, the sheriff repeated, deliberately ignoring the shouts from outside. David slowly raised his head. He looked at the sheriff, at his deputies, at their weapons. He knew this procedure. He knew the rules of the game. He remained silent. Whatever he said would be useless. His word against the word of the son of the man who practically owned this town. He did what was expected of him. He uncurled his fingers, and the heavy Castile flat iron fell to the wet floor with a dull thud. Then he slowly raised his hands, showing he had no intention of resisting. It was a silent admission, not of guilt, of his fate. Take him, Miller said curtly to his deputies, as they approached and roughly grabbed his arms to wrench them behind. His back, a quiet voice spoke. So quiet it was almost lost in the moans of the wounded. No, everyone froze. The sheriff, his deputies, even David. They turned toward the source of the sound. Meilin had stood up. She was still trembling, her face as white as the linen she laundered. But she was on her feet. She took one small step forward, then another, emerging from her safe corner. She clutched the ruined shirts to her chest like a shield. No, she repeated, louder, looking directly at Sheriff Miller. Her English was broken, her accent thick, but every word was filled with desperate resolve. He, not guilty. They bad men. They touch me. He, protect. Isaac Burton's face peered through the doorway, twisted in a sneer. Shut up, you slant-eyed liar, he screeched. Who's going to believe you? Sheriff Miller raised a hand, signaling for silence. He looked at Meilin. He saw her fear, but he saw something else, too, a sincerity that could not be faked. He saw the truth in her tear-stained but steady eyes, and for a moment, something like compassion flickered across his weary face. But he was the sheriff in Jedediah Burton's town, and compassion was as much a luxury as righteous anger. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said, and his voice genuinely held a note of regret. But there are 10 men wounded here, and he's the one on his feet. I have to take him in. That's the law. He nodded to his deputies. They snapped the handcuffs onto David's wrists. The cold metal closed around his skin with familiar finality. As they led him out of the laundry, past an Isaac who was howling with a mixture of rage and triumph, past the frightened faces of the onlookers who had gathered on the street, he glanced back one last time. He looked at Meilin. She was standing amidst the ruin he had created for her sake. She was crying, but she didn't look away. And in that moment, under the cold gaze of the setting sun, an invisible thread of understanding was woven between the ex-convict and the Chinese laundress. A thread spun from injustice, violence, and unexpected courage. The cell in the sheriff's office was a small stone cage with a narrow window high up near the ceiling. It smelled of stale straw, cheap tobacco, and hopelessness. For David Slater, it was almost like home. He sat on the hard cot and leaned his back against the cold wall. The silence after the chaos in the laundry was deafening. He wasn't afraid. Fear was an emotion, and he had left his emotions in the past, buried with his family. He didn't feel despair either. Despair implies hope, and he had stopped hoping long ago. He was calm. It was the calm of a stone at the bottom of a river. The current may be swift, but the stone remains, indifferent to the water rushing over it. He closed his eyes and saw Meilin's face again, the way she had stood up, the way she had spoken. For him, for a convict she had seen for the first time in her life. It was foolish, reckless, and incredibly brave. No one had stood up for him in 20 years. He was a pariah, a ghost that people tried not to see. And this small woman, herself on the lowest rung of the social ladder, had found the strength to say no. That quiet sound, her broken English, echoed in his mind, disturbing the familiar emptiness. The door to the sheriff's office slammed with such force that the iron bars of his cell rattled. David opened his eyes. He heard heavy, confident footsteps, and a low, commanding voice that seemed to make the floorboards sag. "Miller, what the devil is going on in here?" "Mr. Burton," the sheriff's voice was tense, almost obsequious. "I have the situation under control. The suspect is in custody." "Suspect?" A cold laugh rumbled in Jedediah Burton's voice. "My son is at Doc Evans's with a broken arm. His men are maimed, and you call this degenerate a suspect? He should be swinging by dawn, Miller, and you know it." Jedediah Burton was the complete opposite of his son. He wasn't loud or hot-tempered. His power was in his stillness, in his heavy gaze, in his absolute certainty that this entire world, from the wheat in his fields to the people in this town, belonged to him. He walked to David's cell and looked at him through the bars. His eyes were cold and grey like a winter sky. There was no anger in them, only calculation and the kind of disgust one has for a cockroach that has crawled across a clean floor. "So, it's you," he said, studying David like a curious animal. "The one who dared to lay a hand on my son. Do you have any idea what you've done, Drifter?" David remained silent, meeting his gaze. He had seen men like this before, men whose power made them gods in their own eyes. He knew it was useless to argue with them. "Silent good," Burton sneered. "Save your breath, you'll need it on the gallows. Miller, I want Judge Peabody here in the morning. We'll have the swiftest justice in the history of this state. We have witnesses enough, 10 of my boys against, this, and some Chinese woman." He spat the last word out, as if it were a curse. "Mr. Burton, by law, double quotes." The sheriff tried to object. "I am the law." Burton cut him off, not raising his voice, but every word rang with steel. "I built this town. I give these people jobs, and I will not allow some convict trash to set their own rules here. In the morning, Miller, or by noon, this town will have a new sheriff." He turned and walked out without a backward glance. The door slammed again, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. David heard the sheriff let out a heavy sigh and pour himself a whiskey. The glass clinked against the bottle. The game was over before it had even begun. The verdict had been delivered, not in a courtroom, but here, in this small office, by a powerful man in an expensive suit. But while the sheriff drank and David stared into the darkness of his cell, something unforeseen was happening in another part of town. Meilin, after cleaning up what little was salvageable in her ruined laundry, did something she had never done before. She left her home after sunset. She locked the door and, wrapping a shawl around herself, walked through the dark, unfamiliar streets. She was not guided by hope. She was guided by debt. This man had saved her. He had sacrificed his freedom and perhaps his life. She could not let him die in silence. She came to the home of Dr. Evans. The doc was an old, cantankerous, but fair man. He was the one who had treated the wounds and burns of the cowboys brought from her laundry. He had listened to their drunken, boastful stories, in which they portrayed themselves as heroes battling a devil incarnate. But the stories didn't align with what he saw. The wounds were not consistent with a fair fight. When he opened the door and saw the small, trembling Chinese laundress on his doorstep, he was about to send her away, but he saw the determination in her eyes and let her in. And there, in his office that smelled of carbolic acid and herbs, Meilin, stammering and searching for English words, told him everything. From the very beginning. The crude jokes, Isaac grabbing her hair, the humiliation, the fear, and then the stranger's appearance. How he had asked them to leave, how they had attacked first. Dr. Evans listened in silence, stroking his grey beard. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he stood, went to his cabinet, and pulled out the notes he had made earlier that evening. Scald marks on their backs, a wrist fracture from being twisted, a shattered kneecap from a direct blow, a broken nose, a third-degree burn on a hand in the shape of a flat iron. These were defensive wounds, swift, brutal, efficient, but defensive, not the wounds of an aggressor. "They're lying," he said softly, to himself. "They're all lying." He looked at Meilin. "My child," he said wearily, "do you understand who you're going up against? Against Jedediah Burton. That man can crush you like a bug, and no one will even notice." "He saved me," Meilin answered simply, and there was no fear in her voice, only conviction. "I cannot be silent." Dr. Evans looked at her for several long moments, and in that instant, he made a decision. He had lived in this town for too long, turned a blind eye to the Burtons' tyranny for too long, hiding behind his neutrality. "All right," he said. "I can't promise we'll succeed, but I promise you won't be alone." The next morning, the courtroom, which was really just the largest room in the saloon, was packed to the rafters. Judge Peabody, a small, sweaty man with shifty eyes, was already in his place, glancing nervously at Jedediah Burton, who was seated in the front row next to his son, whose arm was in an elaborate sling. The cowboys who could stand lined the wall, posing as innocent victims. David was brought in under guard. He was calm. He scanned the crowd, and, for a moment, his eyes met those of Meilin and Dr. Evans, who were standing at the very back of the room. He gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, as if telling her not to do anything foolish. But it was too late. The sham trial was swift and predictable. Isaac and his men gave perjured testimony, describing an unprovoked attack by a crazed ex-convict. The judge nodded along, asking no difficult questions. Sheriff Miller stood by the door with a stone face, feeling like Judas himself. Just as Judge Peabody was preparing to deliver the verdict, everyone already knew. Dr. Evans's voice called out from the back rows, "Your Honor, I asked to be heard." A hush fell over the room. Everyone turned to look at him. Jedediah Burton shot him a withering glare. "Doctor, this is not a medical conference," the judge mumbled. "Nevertheless, it concerns the wounds I personally treated." Evans persisted. He walked forward, with Meilin following like a shadow beside him, and the nature of these wounds completely contradicts the testimony of the so-called victims. And he began to speak, calmly, methodically, as if giving a lecture at a medical college. He described each wound, explaining how it could have been inflicted. He spoke of defensive actions, of how most of the injuries were designed to neutralize, not to kill. His words, backed by the authority of the only doctor in the county, caused the people in the room to look at each other and whisper, "This is all speculation." Isaac jumped to his feet. "He's just covering for that lying Chinese woman." "Then, let her speak." The doctor's voice boomed through the hall. "Let the woman this was all about tell her side of the story. Or are we afraid to hear the truth, Your Honor?" Judge Peabody began to sweat even more profusely. He looked to Burton for guidance, but the man only gave a slow nod, confident that the testimony of some laundress would change nothing. Meilin walked to the center of the room. All eyes were on her. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She told them everything, leaving out no detail. And her simple, sincere story, her broken English, in which the pain and humiliation sounded without any pretense, made a far greater impression on the crowd than the elaborate lies of the cowboys. A murmur went through the room. They knew the younger Burton's ways. They knew what he was capable of, and Meilin's story sounded frighteningly plausible. Jedediah Burton realized he was losing control of the situation. "Enough of this circus," he thundered, rising to his feet. "It's my men's word against the word of ... these people. Your Honor, deliver the verdict." The judge, shrinking in his chair, opened his mouth, but at that moment, Sheriff Miller, who had been standing by the door the entire time, took a step forward. "Hold on," he said, and his voice was surprisingly firm. "I was at the scene. I saw it with my own eyes. And the testimony of Miss Meilin and Dr. Evans is completely consistent with what I saw there. 10 armed men against 1 unarmed man. This wasn't an assault. It was self-defense and the defense of another. By the law I swore to uphold, David Slater is not guilty." A dead silence fell upon the room. Everyone stared at the sheriff, who had just signed his own death warrant by defying Burton himself. Jedediah turned slowly to face him. His face was a thundercloud. "Miller, you are making a great mistake." "Maybe so," the sheriff replied, and for the first time in years, he stood up straight, without slouching. "But I'd rather be wrong and follow my conscience than be right while serving a tyrant. Slater, you're free to go." He walked over to David and unlocked his handcuffs with his own key. Jedediah Burton's world had cracked. He looked around the room and saw in the townspeople's eyes not fear, but a dawning respect for the sheriff. He knew he had lost, not by force of arms, but by the force of truth. He grabbed his son by his good arm and, without another word, strode out of the saloon, leaving an aura of undisguised menace in his wake. But his magic, the magic of power, had been broken that day. David Slater stood in the street, squinting. In the bright sunlight, he was free. The feeling was strange, unfamiliar. Meilin approached him. She was holding a small bundle. "This is for you," she said softly. He unwrapped it. Inside was his old grey shirt, but now it was perfectly clean, pressed, and neatly mended where it had been torn. A simple but incredibly eloquent gift. He looked at her honest, brave face. "Thank you," he said. It was one of the few words he had spoken in the last 24 hours. "Where will you go now?" she asked. He looked at the road stretching to the horizon, the road that had always been his only home. "Onward," he answered simply. Always onward. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a man who could stay and put down roots. His war was not yet over. But something inside him had shifted. The emptiness no longer seemed so all-consuming. He gave her a final nod, turned, and walked down the dusty street, away from the town he had unintentionally changed. Meilin watched him go for a long time, until his figure dissolved in the shimmering midday heat. Then, she turned and walked toward her laundry. She had a lot of work to do. She had to rebuild everything. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid. She knew she would manage. In the town of Redemption Gulch, 2 lonely people, without even knowing it, had given each other just that redemption. And that was something no one could ever take away from them.